So many people say they believe in justice until a survivor finally speaks out. Then it suddenly becomes, well, why didn't you say something sooner? Why does your story sound so messy? If this really happened, wouldn't you remember every detail? Just recently, a person commented on one of my TikTok videos because I was talking about the Epstein files and the survivors. And one of them said if that was her and a victim's situation, that she would remember every single detail like time, place, clothing, etc. Today, we're going to talk about why that reaction isn't just wrong, it's dangerous. Welcome back to Built to Grow. I'm your host, Valdet Selimaj, and in this episode, we're taking a very trauma-informed deep dive into how trauma affects memory, how it affects the victims and the survivors, and what it's like for them to come forward, and also why the messy, fragmented recall that people use against Epstein survivors is exactly what we'd expect from trauma. I took a week off from creating content, from creating an episode for this podcast, because I was really just, I went through some of the Epstein files, and it was just a lot to sit with. And I was listening to the stories of folks like Sasha Riley sharing their story, and listening to just like reading the signed testimony of like Katie Johnson. It was a lot to sit with. And I know the whole time, though, I thought, I believe every survivor and every victim who shared their story. So my goal here, that's why I made this topic. This is why I made it a topic of the week. My goal here is simple. By the end of this episode, you'll understand enough about trauma and memory that you can spot victim blaming in real time. And you'll have concrete ways to respond with empathy and support instead. Now, before we go any further, a quick content note. We will be talking about the Jeffrey Epstein sex trafficking ring and what survivors of sexual abuse and exploitation go through when they come forward. I'm not going to go into graphic detail, but the themes include sexual violence, abuse of power, and systemic failure to protect the victims. So if you need to take this in small pieces, please do that. Pause, take breaks, walk away, come back to this episode another time. Stop if you don't want to listen anymore. Just please take care of yourself. Honor your nervous system. Honor your mental state. So let's talk about why this conversation matters. The Epstein case, honestly, the Epstein case should have been a turning point, a moment where everyone finally said, enough. We prioritize the survivors. We listen. We act. Instead, what we've seen, especially online, is survivors having their stories picked apart like it's entertainment. Comment sections full of people calling them liars, gold diggers, confused, unstable. Somebody on Instagram threads referred to Sasha Riley as a nut job. We see whole threads obsessing over these tiny inconsistencies in dates or locations, as if the human brain is in some courtroom transcript or some like court of law. Here's the problem. If you don't understand trauma, those inconsistencies can look like proof that nothing happened. However, if you do understand trauma, they look exactly like what we'd expect after chronic abuse, grooming, and overwhelming fear. So in this episode, we're going to connect three key dots. One, what trauma does to brain and body. Two, how that changes memory, especially for sexual abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. And then three, why that makes coming forward incredibly hard, and how our culture often punishes survivors for the very symptoms of trauma. If you care about justice, if you care about accountability, or simply if you just care about being a decent human being, this matters. Because every time we treat trauma-shaped memory as suspicious instead of expected, we're making it harder and way more dangerous for survivors to speak their truth to power. So let's start with Trauma 101. What's actually happening in the brain? So we need like a clear definition first. Trauma isn't just a really bad event. Trauma is what happens when something overwhelms your ability to cope, when your nervous system decides we're not safe, we might not survive this. In those moments, your brain is not trying to create a perfect chronological file labeled what happened on June 14th at 3:42 p.m. Our brain has one function: to keep us alive. And that's exactly what it tries to do during a traumatic event. It's trying to keep you alive. And very quickly, there's a few big things that will happen. One, your survival brain will immediately take over. The amygdala, this little part of our brain that's kind of like our alarm system, goes on high alert. Your body gets flooded with stress hormones, with cortisol, so you can fight, flee, or freeze. So that's one. And then two, the thinking and time tracking parts of your brain go partially offline. Regions like the prefrontal cortex, which is the right in the front of our head, which helps us with reason, planning, putting things in order, getting dialed down. You're not meant to analyze when you are in a heightened state. You're meant to survive. And then number three, the body stores sensations in fragments. Trauma memories are often made up of flashes, so sensations, images, sounds, body feelings, a smell, a look on someone's face. Not a neat movie with like a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, layer into that chronic or complex trauma. And this is exactly what many of the Epstein survivors describe. It's repeated abuse over time. It's grooming and manipulation by adults with money and power. It's situations where resistance feels impossible or dangerous. In those conditions, your nervous system may live in survival mode for a long time. And you're not just encoding events, you're constantly scanning for danger, trying to predict what will keep you safest. Memory gets woven together with fear, shame, and confusion. So from the very beginning, trauma is changing how memories are formed, not just what is remembered. So let's go into that a little bit more. Let's talk about trauma and memory. Let's directly talk about memory. A lot of people imagine memory kind of like a hard drive. It's almost like people think like you hit record, something happens, and then later you just play it back in your head. That's not how human memory, especially traumatic memory, works. There's a few key patterns that show up again and again in trauma research and in the survivor stories. One, memories are stored as fragments. So survivors might remember a hallway, the feeling of a hand on their wrist, the pattern on a carpet, a smell, the sound of a door locking, but not the exact date, time, or even the precise sequence. The brain prioritized survival, not timestamp detail. Which takes us to another point. Time gets weird. During overwhelming events, the parts of the brain that track time go offline. So survivors often describe it as something like, it felt like it went on forever, or it was over in a blur. Or they're not even sure what incident happened first. Recall can be delayed and it can be triggered. Pieces of memory may surface months later, years later, especially when someone becomes safer, gets support, or encounters a trigger. It could be anything. It could be a smell. It could be a news story. It could be a photo. But they may resurface later with a trigger or when they feel safe. Details can also shift without the core truth changing. So a survivor might initially say something happened when they were 15 and later clarify that they were 16. Or they might misremember which house something happened in while still be completely accurate about the abuse itself. So, for people who don't understand trauma, this can sound like changing your story. For people who do understand trauma, it sounds like the nervous system doing its imperfect best to piece together what happened from those scattered fragments. And when we look at the survivors of the Epstein traffic ring, we're not looking at one clean single event. We are looking at grooming over time, multiple locations, powerful adults coordinating abuse, and a whole system built to keep victims confused, compliant, and silent. Of course, the memories are going to be messy. And of course, different survivors will remember different pieces. But that doesn't make the abuse any less real. So I want you to get an idea of what it's like to come forward as a survivor. Like, I want you to imagine something. Imagine something horrific happened to you when you were a teenager. You were hurt by adults who had money, status, and connections. And maybe even at that time, you didn't have the language for what was happening. And so you carry that for years. You're not sure anyone's going to believe you. You're not sure you believe yourself sometimes because shame and grooming and gaslighting do that to people. You're just trying to function, go to school, work a job, build a life, while parts of your body and your brain are still stuck back there. Then one day, the Epstein story breaks again. Names are back in the headlines. There's a documentary. There's a lawsuit. There's pressure. Someone asks you to tell your story, or you feel like you have to speak because the alternative, staying silent while people debate whether this even happened, is unbearable. When survivors come forward in that context, a few things are happening internally. 1, fear of not being believed. What if they call me crazy? What if they say I'm doing this for attention or money? 2, there's always a fear of retaliation. These are powerful people. What happens to me or my family if I speak up? Katie Johnson was threatened when she was going to the lawsuit. The lawsuit was happening against her and between her, Donald Trump, and Jeffrey Epstein, but she was threatened. So that was a fear of retaliation, and that was actually in the signed affidavit. Then there's self-doubt. My memories are so jumbled. What if I get a detail wrong? And they use that to say none of it happened. And then the fourth thing is also re-traumatization. Telling the story, especially in public or especially in a legal setting, can bring the body back into freezer panic. Meanwhile, the outside world often responds with demands for perfect courtroom-ready recall. They respond with obsession over the minor details inside of the core allegations. And then there's this endless commentary about survivors' motives, clothing, tone of voice, and emotional reactions. I heard a lot of people, when I bring up the 2023 civil case against Donald Trump for sexually assaulting E. Jean Carroll, the things that people say about that woman to victim blame her are obscene. And that's why one of the many reasons why I wanted to create this episode. It's really hard to overstate how much courage it takes to walk into that environment and say, this happened to me. Especially when the people you're accusing are wealthy, connected, and have already gotten away with things for years. So why do so many people default to doubting survivors, especially in cases like Epstein's? Well, a few patterns show up again and again when it comes to this. 1, discomfort with systemic abuse. It's deeply unsettling to accept that powerful people, institutions, and even governments have allowed or participated in abuse. It is easier psychologically to poke holes in a survivor's story than to confront how bad the system really is. Number 2, myths about memory. Many of us are never taught how memory actually works. We assume that if something really happened, that we'd remember it like a movie. So when a survivor is unsure about dates or they mix up details, we treat that as proof that they're lying instead of a sign of trauma. Number 3, we have victim blaming culture. We live in a culture that asks, why were you there? Instead of why did they hurt you? There's actually there's a logical fallacy called the just world fallacy, where we believe that the world is just, and so good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. But when bad things happen to good people, we get scared that could happen to us. And so it's a default setting for us to say, well, why were you there? Or maybe she shouldn't have been wearing that. Because we can't fathom the idea that could also happen to us too. And that's why we look for reasons of why we maybe pick apart a story, or sometimes even when we ask why somebody passed away, because we just want a little bit of justification that it won't happen to us. And with the Epstein ring, that often turns into judging what survivors wore, like whether they went back, whether they took money, instead of focusing on the exploitation and the imbalance of power instead. And then number 4, cognitive dissonance. If someone has admired, voted for, or benefited from the people around Epstein, it can be painful to admit those people were involved in or complicit with abuse. Doubting survivors can feel like protecting your own worldview. So here's the reframe. When you understand trauma, you stop expecting survivors to present as perfect witnesses. You stop demanding a spotless, unchanging narrative from someone whose brain was in survival mode. And I always have to echo, all of this trauma is already happening. In cases for the Epstein files, a lot of the children and the women were also drugged. And that also distorts memory and time. And so that's also worth considering. Instead, you need to start asking yourself a different question. You have to ask yourself, given what we know about trauma, does this person's story, even with its gaps and shifts, look and sound like what we'd expect from someone who's been harmed? In Epstein-related cases, the answer, again and again, is yes. So let's get practical. If you want to be more trauma-informed when you hear stories from Epstein survivors or anyone in your life, here are some concrete shifts that you can make starting right now. 1, lead with belief, not cross-examination. Instead of, are you sure? Why didn't you say something sooner? Try, thank you for trusting me with this. I'm sorry this happened to you. I'm here for you. 2, drop the demand for perfect memory. Assume that details might get fuzzy, out of order, or incomplete. And that is normal for trauma. You don't need a timestamped timeline to care about someone's safety and healing. Number 3, avoid the gotcha questions. These are questions that are designed to catch inconsistencies. Well, last time you said X. That rarely comes from a place of care. If you're genuinely confused, you can say, can I check if I understood this right? And let the survivor guide how much they want to clarify. 4, center the survivor's needs, not your curiosity. You don't need every graphic detail to take someone seriously. Focus on what they need now: safety, support, options, connection to resources. Focus on that. 5, notice your own defensiveness. If you catch yourself thinking, oh, this is too big, it can't be true, pause and ask yourself, what feels threatening about believing this person? Often the threat isn't the facts. It's our sense of safety in the world or our faith in certain situations. Even going back to that just world fallacy. 6, be careful with how you talk about high-profile cases. When you joke about Epstein or casually question survivors online, real people you know, are absorbing that. And some of them have their own stories they've never told. Your commentary can either make it safer for them to speak or reinforce the fear that they'll be torn apart if they do. So let's wrap this up. Let's land this. If you remember nothing from this episode, I want you to remember these 3 things, okay? 3 things. 1, trauma changes how memory works. The brain in survival mode is not a clean recording device. Fragmented, delayed, and shifting recall is often a sign of trauma, not deception. 2, messy memory does not cancel out harm. Survivors of the Epstein trafficking ring and survivors everywhere are navigating shame, fear, grooming, and power imbalances. Expecting them to deliver a flawless, courtroom-style narrative is absolutely unrealistic, and it's definitely unfair. And then number 3, you have power in how you respond. You might not control the justice system or the media, but you do control whether you pile on skepticism or choose empathy. Your default posture, especially in conversations with friends, family, and online, matters. So here's what I'm asking of you. A couple things. Take a moment after this episode to notice where maybe you've been quick to doubt survivors, especially in complex cases like Epstein's. And I want you to decide, what kind of person do you want to be when someone says this happened to me? And then also share this episode with at least one person who still says, well, if it really happened, wouldn't they remember it better? And invite them into a more trauma-informed lens. Look, survivors don't need us to be perfect. They need us to be willing to learn, to listen, and to stand with them, even when the details are hard, messy, or incomplete. Thanks for listening to Built to Grow. If this episode was helpful, consider sharing it, leaving a review, and starting a conversation with someone in your world. And I will see you in the next episode.